Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webcast, Taking the Nightmare Out of File Server Migrations. And I do want to give you a hint right off the top. It's not just about the files. No matter what anyone's told you, a file server migration is more than just migrating files, and we'll get into that in our presentation. We've got two speakers on the line with us today. Our guest speaker is Greg. Say hi, Greg.
Hi, Greg.
Greg is a senior partner and principal technologist with Concentrated Technology. He's also been an editor for TechNet Magazine, Redmond Magazine, Real Time Publishers. We're very lucky to have him today because he's a very sought-after speaker. You've probably seen him at events like Tech Mentor, TechEd, VMworld. He is a Microsoft MVP and a VMware vExpert as well. So he's very well qualified for what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Jayson Gehri. I work for ScriptLogic, and I joined in 2009, originally as a product marketing manager. I've got over 10 years experience in marketing and technical areas, and I'm currently director of product marketing, and I'm responsible for promoting and evangelizing our ScriptLogic and Quest software solutions to the IT community, and I'll be speaking along with Greg here today. I'll tell you a little bit about ScriptLogic. We are part of Quest Software. You'll see some of this transitional branding. We've actually been owned by Quest Software since 2007. ScriptLogic itself was originally founded in the year 2000, and we focus on 4 key areas of Windows management. So we deal with desktop management, help desk management, server management, and Active Directory management. We have a customer base of over 30,000 worldwide, and they vary anywhere from the small SMB shops all the way up to the Fortune 100. Our main office here for ScriptLogic is in Boca Raton, Florida, where today it is sunny and in the high 70s. For anyone else around the country, sorry, one reason we live in Florida is for the good weather. Greg, you're in Colorado, aren't you?
I am in sunny and sometimes frigid Colorado.
Not quite as warm, but a little too warm for your taste today, huh?
Indeed, actually it is. It's in the mid-40s over here today, which is not great for the snowpack, I will say that.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how I'm doing on the beach this weekend. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
Well, I get to start this whole webinar out on kind of a negative note, right? Yeah, file savers, right? So for the however many, actually quite a few people that are joined here at this point, I'm guessing you're here because you probably think the same thing that I do whenever anybody talks to you about file servers. Are they not just the world's biggest pain in the neck? I mean, okay, so we've got these file servers that are out there, and you probably have more than one. On any one particular file server, they've got some 80 gazillion different files and folders and 80 gazillion different permissions to manage on those files and folders. And so really, I don't know, these file servers in many ways they're just a real pain in the neck. And what makes them really even more challenging is the fact that to deal with these file servers, right, the management tools that you have available to deal with these file servers are some of the easiest to screw up tools that are out there really in the world today. So when you've got, go ahead and flip the slide there, Jayson, go ahead, when you've got all of these files and all these folders that you have to deal with, and you're doing it via this really, really easy to screw up interface, it just becomes a real nightmare. And so you're here today to hopefully understand some ways in which you can deal with those file servers even better. And then also when those otherwise nightmare activities come around, which is the opportunity to get to migrate those files from one server to another, how might you actually go about doing that? Now, we're going to be a little tongue-in-cheek here because, I mean, admittedly, this has not been one of those types of activities that has been really great for really any period of time. And in fact, you remember the whole shift from, what was it, 2000 to 2003 or 03 to 08, when the actual interface that you would use for managing the permissions of those files and folders got actually more complicated. Or even more awful. I don't know. We've all accidentally, or perhaps we blame it on somebody else, we've all accidentally at some point in our lives accidentally checked that, you know, that checkbox, right? That's the never, ever, 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 ever check this box in Windows whenever you're going to migrate permissions, and you accidentally, inadvertently overwrite all the permissions for a beautiful folder structure that you just applied all those perms to before. And so we've all made those mistakes. I'm guessing probably a lot of us, myself included, have said, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore because those windows that Windows uses, those GUI tools that Windows uses, are just so awful. I'm going to go to command line. And then you start getting to the command line, and you start realizing, well, wait a minute, even the command line tools are a pain in the neck. Whether you're using iCackles or Cackles or Xcackles or even the VBS version of Xcackles, which I still don't understand why that exists, there's some 80 bazillion command line arguments that you would need in order to be successful in changing perms and transferring files and all that stuff. So we've got what is essentially a nightmare, a pretty big nightmare, really. And when you think about all the tasks, specifically when it has to do with migration, that are required in order to get files and folders from one place to another, well okay, let's break down those tasks. Right? What are the different pieces that make up this whole nightmare that we think of as it relates to migrating a bunch of files and their folders off to a new server somewhere? And it's one of those tasks where you kind of put it down on paper, and it feels or it seems to the unaided eye as something that's just really simplistic. You know, it's very difficult for you to kind of, if you go home and talk to your significant other about the pain that you went through in transferring files, they would probably look at you funny and go, well, aren't you just copying files? And in a way you just are, because, I mean, look at these 4 steps here. They seem fairly simplistic when you look at them on paper, but really there's a lot of complexity that's involved. So what are those 4 steps? Number 1, you got to take a look at what you got. You have to know what's on the old server so that you can compare that to what you will find on the new server, and then also, you know, verify that you've done everything correctly at the very last step. Step 2 is once you're, you know, as you're going through the process of looking at that stuff, you got to find out where you've made mistakes in the past. You know, maybe this file or folder got transferred from somewhere and it's got a bad, you know, SID attached to it. And so you're seeing not usernames and groups, but you're seeing long strings of digits that correspond to some no longer relevant, you know, ID. Maybe you've put the wrong permissions on there because you moved it instead of copied it, or copied it instead of moved it. And so what you thought, or the people that you thought had the right permissions, actually don't. Any number of different problems can occur because of all the weird idiosyncrasies that occur inside of Windows and how it deals with its files and folders. So that step 2 requires you to fix those mistakes, whether yours or somebody else's, that occurred. You got to copy the stuff. That in and of itself, you would think would be an easy activity, but we've all gone through copy activities before where stuff didn't copy, or files were left in a locked state. There was some lock on the file, or somebody accidentally crashed the app job or the scheduled task that was doing the copy, or any of the innumerable mistakes or errors that can occur in a very large copy that are awful to try to figure out what happened. And then lastly, once you're done, you've got to go back and compare what you did to what you had so that you can make sure that you've done it correctly. Jayson, let's spend some time, I think, because I think the people that are here on this webinar are here because they know what those 4 steps are, and they're probably, they're probably here because they've not really had a really good experience in the past, wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I know it can be a nightmare, and there's a lot to be able to, verify to make sure you've had a successful migration. So, these things are critical, even though they seem kind of mundane.
So way back in the day, right, we had command line tools. You remember this command line tool? It's called copy, right? And, we used that for a while, and it could do some very basic stuff. And then, all right, well, copy wasn't enough, so we created this Xcopy, which was, extreme copying. And so we've developed all of these command line tools natively. Sort of Windows and Microsoft have developed these tools in order to help this whole process. And they actually, if you look at them, if you kind of use them what they're for, you can in many ways get some interesting results out of them. The first tool here is not a native tool, but it is one, it says native tool, but it's one you download from Microsoft's site. This is an old sysinternals tool from long ago called Access Enum. And I put the URL down there if you want to grab a copy. It's freely downloadable from Microsoft's sysinternals site. And Access Enum is one of those tools that I've used for a very long period of time to help identify where permissions in a particular folder structure are different from where they would sit in whatever top-level structure that I've identified. So you're taking a look here in the picture of C program files, but I could do it against a share if I wanted to, and point this tool at the top level of a share, and then have it identify for me areas that are different, or areas that are not configured correctly. And so if I've got enough time and enough, well, if my eyes don't give out by the time I scroll all the way through all the files and folders in that share, well, you can see very quickly how I could identify, all right, well, what are the permissions and how are they assigned to the different files and folders. Now, I'll freely admit that this is a great tool, but so with a tool like Access Enum, what you get is visibility. Right? So you can enum stuff, that's what the enum part of Access Enum is all about, but getting that enum and actually doing things with that enum are two very different things. I mean, it's like going to the DMV as opposed to hoping that you're going to get out of there in less than 6 hours. So Access Enum, one of those great little tools that you can download from Microsoft's site and useful for helping you identify the current state of your file server environment. Now, Jayson, I'm sure you're probably going to try to talk me into something else.
Absolutely. You know, that's what I'm here for. I've got to tell you how ScriptLogic products can help kind of simplify this, because it seems like Access Enum, you know, it provides some information, but it seems kind of painful, and I don't know if everyone has the time to go through that. Okay.
Stick around.
So going back to what ScriptLogic offers, we actually have a product that's called Enterprise Security Reporter. And rather than doing an enum, there's actually a great way that you can use a GUI-based product to run customized reports or even pre-canned reports that will give you information on the security permissions that you have on your servers. And the great thing about Enterprise Security Reporter is that it's agentless. So you don't have to go install a bunch of agents on all your servers to go collect the security information. It can do it without any agents. And a tool like Access Enum gives you your permissions at the point that the tool is run, but it doesn't let you know how things change over time. And with a product like ESR, you can run a report today and then have a report run the next week, the next week, the next week, and then compare what the permissions changes have been. So you don't have to go through the entire list of permissions and try to figure it out yourself. And we're talking about file server migrations in this webcast, but what if you want to do permissions reporting on SQL or SharePoint or Active Directory? You want to have access to that, and you can do that in ESR, Enterprise Security Reporter. So let me jump over to that product now and show you a little bit about that and how it applies to running reports on those permissions before you do your migration. So Enterprise Security Reporter is a snapshot-based reporting tool. And for those of you who work in industries that have a lot of compliance, especially around security, there's a lot of pre-canned reports in here that will help you with compliance issues like HIPAA, PCI, SOX, and you'll be able to report and provide this information to auditors, but you'll also be able to pull those reports and see if you're out of compliance so that you can go back and fix those things. Down here you can see we also have canned reports for SQL, for SharePoint, group membership, domains, etc. But for the purpose of this webcast, we're talking about file migrations. And one thing that we want to pay attention to are explicit permissions, because we're giving those specific permissions to groups or users. And if we don't go back and change those permissions or update them as needed, then those permissions are going to stay. So that's one of the first places that we want to report on, is to see what explicit permissions there are. And with ESR, you can just double-click this report here, and there's a wizard that will walk you through building that report. So you don't have to worry about, command line prompts or making sure you have the right format in how you're entering the command. You can just build the report. And rather than spend the time doing that, I've got a couple of reports here already run. This is explicit permissions for folder report. And you'll see here it's decently organized so that you can see what drive or folder or share that you're in this case, what folder you're in, what permissions we're looking at. And then in this report, we have in line the different accounts or groups that have the different permissions. So as you go down, it's a pretty extensive report, but it's also well organized. So you're not having to spend your time looking at line after line. You can jump down to the location, the permission, etc., and then look very quickly at what users or groups have access to these different resources. Now for me, I want to look at the shares, because there are some very specific issues that you'll run into when you're setting permissions for shares. One of which being, you want to look at what groups have what access to your share. Some groups may not need certain access. And typically, you do not want to assign explicit permissions to individuals on a share. So you want to go back and look and see if any of those permissions have been assigned explicitly to an individual. So we're going to look at those things, and for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to look at the marketing/presentations share here. And so one thing I'm going to look at is right here where you see the facilities permission, they've got full control. I don't know if it makes sense to give the facilities group full control to our marketing share. So that's kind of a security issue. We may want them to see the files. We may want them to execute on the files that are in the marketing drive, but we don't want them to delete, add, change anything. And if it was another folder like finance or human resources, that could be a huge security breach. So we want to make sure that we fix that. Also, you can see here, we've got some individuals who've got explicit permissions, and we don't want them to have that here. So we are going to identify that this is a problem that we will fix in the future. But before we do that, we're actually going to hop back over to Greg, and he's going to talk about the next step in this migration process, which is fixing the oopses that we found.
Wait a minute. So you're already kind of pitching your own automated solution for how to fix these problems, aren't you? I know what
I've got to set myself up.
So, all right. Well, let me illustrate to you the completely manual, uninteresting way of doing things. No, I'm kidding. So we've identified that there are some problems here, and in using native tools, right? There's a couple of native tools out there. Back in Windows Vista and Windows 7, we have a brand new version of Cackles, which is now iCackles. And a little piece of trivia there: the I in there is because it now does mandatory access controls. So you can add mandatory access controls with iCackles. So iCackles is one of those nifty tools that helps prevent permissions risk. And we've all gotten permissions risk before, where you're going through a huge folder structure and right-clicking and choosing permissions and selecting the right checkboxes. Sometimes I swear I wonder if Microsoft's permissions UI is an OSHA violation, and so that's why they had to go write iCackles. Now, what's interesting about iCackles is that all by itself, it can be, I don't know, it enumerates a whole lot of information, almost too much information, because if you don't care about mandatory access controls, well, you're going to see it anyway, and trying to wade through all the stuff can be challenging. So the challenge here is not just using iCackles to manage permissions, but actually to manage those permissions over time. Right? So there's those pesky little help desk people that are always trying to help. Somebody calls in and says, hey, I need access. Somebody from the facilities group calls in and says, hey, I need access to this marketing share, and then they go and just add them into the marketing share. And that's not right, but your help desk people are there to assist you as well. So one possible kind of nifty solution that you might get out of something like iCackles is kind of taking iCackles and turning it just a bit onto its head. And actually, down here on the bottom, I wrote an article about this in TechNet Magazine, Microsoft's TechNet Magazine, actually a number of years ago, on how you could actually potentially use iCackles as a scheduled task, as a tool to manage your permissions over time. So you can see over here on the right is this nice little folder structure here, and I've got my shared, and I have my finance, and then the budget folder, and metrics, and the marketing folder, and then for each one I've got the permissions that I know need to have access. So what's to say that if you know what those permissions are supposed to be, that you couldn't write yourself up a little script? So here's step one. Okay, in step one, all you need to do is take the iCackles command and document what your permission structure needs to be, but document it inside of iCackles. So here's iCackles. All right, so iCackles, here's the shared marketing folder. I'm going to turn on inheritance with a :R switch, and I'm going to grant finance users both the OI and CIR permission, and also read permission to the file admins or add, oh gosh, I can never remember what all these different things are. Anyway, you go look at all the help files to figure out what all those switches mean, and then document those perms in iCackles. And then you can set that file up as a batch file, and then use a scheduled task to repeat resetting the permissions to the entire structure every evening, so that if your help desk people attempt to do any fixes that you haven't already approved, well, you know that the next morning, if the script works, well, then you're going to unfix any of their fixes. So take that, help deskers. I don't know, what do you think, Jayson? That's a tool I've used before, even though I can't remember all the switches.
Well, that's part of the problem then, isn't it? If you can't remember the switches, then you might not be setting things up properly. And, you know, it seems like if you're doing a batch file as scheduled task, it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility because you'd have to go in and edit that batch file every time you need to update your standard permission settings, right?
Well, yeah, but you would have I guess you'd have your permissions documented. That's the only way you could really document permissions in a way that was useful, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I don't know about that. So obviously, my next point is to talk about how you can do a little bit better than cobbling together iCackles and scheduled tasks and trying to do batch files. ScriptLogic offers a product called Security Explorer, and the great thing about it is it's a centralized permissions management product. So you don't have to worry about going onto each server or trying to run this across the network and trying to manage permissions in different places using command lines or iCackles or scheduled tasks. You actually can do it in a GUI-based product. And not only can you manage your permissions, but let's say you mess something up or somebody on your team messes something up and deletes a whole set of permissions, or completely sets up an OU wrong and the permissions wrong. Well, you don't have to go back and fix every little thing. You can just roll back to the last backup of your good permission set and restore that. And you can do that using Security Explorer. And I mentioned that this is a centralized permissions management product, and that is true because not only can you manage permissions on your file servers, but from the same console you can do SharePoint, Exchange, SQL, users and groups, services and tasks. Services and tasks is a huge pain, which is not really what we're covering today, but just to touch on it. If your organization has password expiration policies, it's a pain to have to go and log into each server and reset the service and task passwords on all those different items. So you can do that really easily in Security Explorer. So that's just kind of the benefit of using a tool that's designed to do this. So I'm going to show you what Security Explorer looks like. So this screen is very simplistic, and honestly, I think someone who's never been introduced to this product could really start using it. This is our quick task dashboard, and you click any one of these, and you could very quickly start granting permissions. It's a little wizard that lets you start selecting what location you want to grant the permissions at, what groups or individuals you want to grant permissions for, etc. And you can do that for all these tasks. You can go and find your unknown or deleted accounts very quickly, and you don't have to know much about the product to do that. Now, the other thing I mentioned, and you can see here to the left, is that we have the ability to manage the permissions on all these different technologies. Again, SharePoint, SQL, Exchange, services and tasks. But obviously, for our purposes today, we want to pay attention to the file server. What are we going to do with all these permissions issues we found in the last step? Whether you're using Greg's solution of Access Enum or whether you're using a product like Enterprise Security Reporter to identify those permissions issues. So I'm going to click on the Browse tab over here, and it's going to give me the list of shares that are on my server. I like to say that Security Explorer is really a time saver. It's kind of a click and done, point, click, done kind of solution versus something like Windows Explorer. For example, on our marketing presentation share, I can right-click, and in one click, I can revoke permissions. So if I don't want facilities to have permissions, I can add them to this list, revoke the permissions, and I'm done. But if I wanted to do that in Windows Explorer, it's like 5 clicks. Right-click, 1 click. Properties, 2 clicks. Security, 3 clicks. Edit, 4 clicks. Facilities, add, remove, 5 clicks. So I'm at 5 clicks in Windows Explorer. Plus, I have to navigate to that server, to that folder, to that share, to that group, and remove that permission, whereas I can do that just by right-clicking here in Security Explorer. And you can see there's a lot more options here. You can grant, revoke, clone those permissions. You can back up and restore your security. You can schedule backups as well to go on an ongoing basis. You can even create or remove your shares or your drives from here. So there's a lot of functionality you can do right from this one view. Now, when we were in a previous step, I was going on about how there were some groups and users that had permissions to our marketing presentation share that really didn't need it. And the prime example right here is our facilities group. Why do we want to give our facilities group and our business full control of a marketing drive? That just isn't good business practice. So I'm going to right-click on this and modify the permission. So you can see we've got our object, we've got the name, we've got the permission, and we've got all the different permissions outlined here. Well, all I'm going to do is change allow full control to allow read and execute. I want them to be able to see the files. I want them to be able to launch the presentations, but I don't want them to change anything. And you see that I automatically updated all the checkboxes here, and I don't have to manually figure out, well, do I want them to do this but not this? It's just done here for you just by selecting the different permission sets. Now I can click OK. Bam. Permissions updated, no issues. You can see we've changed it here, read and execute, so we're all set. Now, I also pointed out the fact that we had some individual users that had explicit permissions in our share, and that's really not best practice. So I can control-click. I can highlight all of these individual users, right-click, and delete the permission. It's that simple. And if I do this and I did something wrong, don't forget, I can restore my security as well. Now, one thing Greg mentioned when we started is there's an issue with deleted accounts. If you delete an account and they have explicit permissions, their SID is still floating out there as an orphan. So that permission is technically still attached to wherever it is, and that's a security issue. So we want to identify and remove those orphan SIDs. So I can do that again just by control-clicking, right-click, delete the permission. So those deleted accounts are no longer part of the permissions for the share, and this is so critical. You don't want to bring all of these dirty, convoluted, unneeded permissions onto your new server. You want to fix it now so that after the migration, you don't have to go back and deal with this again. So that's pretty much what I want to show you when we're dealing with fixing, any of these security issues. I think it's a little bit better than iCalcs and scheduled tasks. What do you think, Greg?
So OIC, object inherit container. So what's the difference between an object and a container? And anyway, sorry, I was trying to figure out all the switches again. It's been a long time. Jayson, one of these times, are we going to do a webinar where I get to have the part where the native tools are actually better than the ScriptLogic tools?
I don't know. If Microsoft builds one, then we might be out of business, so then we wouldn't need to hold a webinar.
I will talk about an amazing tool, though, that all of us have used at some point in our life, and that's RoboCopy. And RoboCopy is awesome for multiple different reasons, one of which is the fact that it can do all kinds of awesome stuff, and number two is the fact that RoboCop is a part of RoboCopy.
Nice. Really nice.
Why did they stop making those movies? Was it really because they got to be that bad?
I think so. I don't even want to go there.
RoboCop and RoboCopy have a lot of switches, and although they do different things depending on which one you're trying to address, all of those different switches are definitely helpful for you. In fact, here are all the switches for RoboCopy. Well, most of the switches. As you can see there by the slider bar in the upper right, that's only a small portion of the switches. But what this does is it gives you an idea of the richness of RoboCopy and how just flexible it is in helping you identify all the different files and folders that you need. If you can but master those switches, and in fact, Jeff Hicks will show you how at that URL over on ScriptLogic's SMBIT site. If you can master those switches, you too can be as powerful as RoboCop. In fact, there in that second bullet down there on the bottom, I have a number of switches that you might potentially use for doing this kind of file migration. So I've got server 1 share to server 2 share, and then I've got the copy all switch, and then I want to copy whatever the B thing does, and then security, and I want to mirror it. And I've got to set the retries to 0, and then the W to 0 also, otherwise it takes too long. And then I've got to set a log file out too. So all of those are things that you can download using RoboCopy, ways that you can use RoboCopy in order to complete a migration of a bunch of files and folders with their perms over to another computer. Now what's interesting is there's also this really awesome hidden RoboCopy feature called Open File Support. And Jayson, are you familiar with this feature at all?
No, why don't you tell me what it's all about?
Well, I'm actually, it actually isn't a feature. So there actually is no open file support in RoboCop or RoboCopy. So why don't you spend a little bit of time talking about some of the ScriptLogic stuff?
Sure. Well, it's no wonder why I hadn't heard of open file support then.
Well, exactly.
Too bad. So this is all great, Greg. I mean, it seems like you can do all of these switches in RoboCopy, so you can really granularly control your migration. But you've got to know all these commands, and just you work a lot with this stuff, and it seems like you can't even remember it all. So there's got to be an easier way.
I would like to contend that ScriptLogic does not actually have a product that addresses RoboCop.
True. We don't have one of those, mechanized machines to go hunt RoboCop down, but I think we can handle RoboCopy. So the product that I'm going to talk about is called Secure Copy, and really what it does is it copies files and permissions. It does a lot of what RoboCopy does that Greg was just saying, but you don't have to remember all those switch commands. It's GUI-based again, so it's really simple to use, and I'll show you in a second. Now, Greg, do you know if there's a switch in RoboCopy to throttle bandwidth so you don't take up all your network load?
There may be one. There absolutely is a switch in RoboCop to throttle bandwidth. In fact, that was part of the first movie.
Well, Secure Copy does have bandwidth throttling because, let's face it, we don't all want to come in on the weekend and do a file migration. So we can throttle the bandwidth in Secure Copy so you don't take all the load on your network and people can still work while you're migrating those files. Now, the other big thing is, Greg mentioned a switch where you could set your retries. And one thing that a lot of solutions will do is they'll skip any files that are locked or in use by any services or tasks or users. Well, with Secure Copy, you can do volume shadow copy. And so you can copy those files over and not have to worry about whether they're locked or in use. And the whole goal here is an automated migration. I mean, if you're in Windows Explorer, you don't want to be manually moving files from one screen to the other, or if you're using something like RoboCopy, you don't want to have to sit there the entire time of the migration and just ensure everything is working properly. So let me jump over to Secure Copy and kind of show you how it can be, a good deal easier. So this is Secure Copy. This is one of the job screens that we have. And remember all the switches Greg was talking about and all the commands that you had to enter? Well, it's really easy here. I mean, you click here, you put in your source. You click here, you put in your target. And then we've got these switches or settings down here. So do I want to copy all files or only copy change files? Do I want to synchronize or do I not want to synchronize? Do I want to send an email notification or not? Do I want to ignore the offline files or recall them? So I've got all these switches right here. And again, you don't have to know much about the product to schedule a job. But I do want to show you some of the more advanced features. So we'll go in here, and I'll just kind of outline some of them. So we've got, again, our source and our destination. Here's the checkbox we're going to use for our volume shadow copy, and this can be important. But only if you install Secure Copy on your source server. If you're trying to do a migration over the network, you can't use volume shadow copy. But we do have the functionality to let you retry those locked files if you want. We have some synchronization options as well. If you're doing a backup instead of a migration, you can only change, or you can only migrate changed files to the target, or you can decide to migrate everything. We've got some purge options, archiving, synchronization, and permissions. There may be an example where you just want to migrate the files and not the permissions. You can do that, although we do recommend that when you're migrating a file server that you obviously migrate those permissions along with the files. We have some filters as well. So if you need to target your migration, and there are a lot of files on the server that you don't want to bring over, things like media files, MP3s, JPEGs, movies, even temp files. If you have a lot of temp files on the server, you don't need to migrate those. So you can exclude those from the migration. You can also exclude specific folders. Like let's say I have a personal folder on my server for some reason. I need to exclude that from the migration. We can also exclude by date and by file size. Now we're getting into performance. So here's where we're setting up our multi-threading to improve the performance of, shorten the time of the migration. The bandwidth throttling, so we aren't, loading our network down during the day. And then if we're not doing the volume shadow copy, we can set how many times and for how long we want to retry our locked files. If your file server is a member server, you're going to want to migrate your local groups and users. You can do that here, and here's all the settings for that. You can migrate your file shares. You can do things like do data compression if you'd like to. You can do some mapping if you need to map to some new folders on the new server. And of course, you can do an email notification once the migration is done. So you don't have to sit there in front of the computer and just watch the files migrate. You can get a notification and come back to it, and it gives you time to go do something else. So, Greg, what do you think about that? How's that compared to RoboCop or RoboCopy?
Well, it sure doesn't blow up other mechanized equipment, but I guess it definitely improves the whole file copy process.
True.
Somebody mentioned a tool actually called Rich Copy that is another Microsoft tool that you can use for doing copies as well. I don't know. Rich Copy, probably like RoboCopy, but more expensive. More expensive. I mean, when you multiply by 0, you still get 0 then, I guess. I don't know. Just for the record, it is remarkably difficult to tell humorous jokes when you can only talk and you can't actually hear back. You know, Jayson. So yeah, we're trying here. I have been actually working with I don't know if you know this, Jayson, my wife and I, but we've been working on not applying value judgments to things. So the compare-object command is a new option for you so that you can actually compare something without applying a value judgment. I'm having a great time here. So what's interesting, all right, so we've got that open file feature that you don't have with RoboCopy. And so consequently, if anybody's using a file or folder, if it's locked open for some reason or another, well, RoboCopy's going to have a problem with that. And if you've been working with RoboCopy for any period of time, that lock problem can sometimes be challenging because the retry on the lock generally doesn't really work that well. And I think the default retry is something like 1 million retries, which could take what would normally be a 6-hour copy and turn it into a 9-year copy. For each of those files that are open. So what you have to kind of do with RoboCopy in order to make it work is tell it to just ignore the files that are open, and you'll come swing back through and pick them up a little bit later. Previously, we used to use tools like WinDiff to do this. WinDiff is deprecated now. They don't really have it around. But PowerShell is this nifty non-value judging compare-object command that you can use. So ridiculous power here at the command line with compare-object. In fact, if you want to compare two different folder structures, so your before and your after folder structure, let's go ahead and throw that up on the screen there. Right there at the command line, you can use compare objects, and then there's the original path, and I just put C colon backslash to make things easy. So there's the original path, and then there's the new path, and you kind of want to bound those using the get child item -recurse command so that you can get all the things that are underneath C drive and underneath the E drive. And once you've got those mapped, well, then you do the comparison using compare object. Now, what's awesome about this is just all this ridiculous power at the command line. And the speed is just ridiculous also. And when I guess when I say ridiculous, I don't mean that in the good way. It ain't fast. And you do get some error messages, though. And one of the big features of the error messages is that they are colored in red. So right there, you probably, now let me ask you this, does ScriptLogic support red error messages?
Ooh, I don't know. Red's a pretty good color, but I don't know if it's mastered that one yet.
Aha! And we have this interesting little output here, and if you've seen the output, and I didn't put a slide or a picture of the output here, but it shows, all right, well, there's an arrow pointing this way that means something, and an arrow pointing that way that means something else, and it's supposed to help you identify which one isn't there, but I haven't quite figured that part out yet. So if you're more intelligent than me as it comes to PowerShell, the compare-object command could be useful for you. Jayson?
Thanks, Greg. So, yeah. We're back to command line, and I'm sorry, but it looks like there were a lot of errors with that command there on your screen. So
well, I think that's just one error.
Okay, well, that looked like a lot of errors. But what do you do then? I mean, if you run this big, long PowerShell script, you get this return, you're trying to read through the results. I mean, depending on how big your copy or your migration is, I mean, that could be a lot of information to try to parse out and figure out what happened. So you've got to do it, though, because you can't do a migration and then just trust that it works and just assume, you know, everything's there, we're good. And what happens if you decommission that server and not everything got moved over or something like that? So you have to conduct a post-migration analysis. And, we have a product, well, actually, it's still secure copy, so it's the same product you're using to migrate the files you use to do the analysis, which makes sense, right? So there's customized and pre-canned reports that you can run that let you know all the information that Greg was kind of referring to. Did the files copy? The ones that were locked, did they, how many times did we try them? What was the reason they were locked? If you want a really quick overview of how the migration is going, we've got a dashboard. We've even got logs. So if you do want to dig through all those logs and dig deep into the migration and what happened, you can view the logs right from secure copy. So let me show you what those look like. Okay, so we're going to jump over to logs and reports, but first I'm going to show you this dashboard here. So Greg, we don't have red, but we do have pink and yellow.
Score.
So pink tells you the files that were copied, and then yellow tells you what's purged, and I'm assuming if there were some other statuses that we would have some other colors as well, but in this particular job, this is what we have. You also see at what speed the job was copied in, so how many megs per second, and then some other summary items here that you can see, different file types, their sizes, how many were skipped, how many were purged, et cetera, et cetera. The logs viewer is pretty cool because, okay, we're looking at this job. Look at how many log entries we've got. I mean, it just goes and goes and goes. So are you going to have to pour through all of that to find what you're looking for? Not necessarily, because you can filter on what you want to see. So in this case, what if I just want to see the errors? I can filter just on the errors, and this is a much shorter list. I can also filter on file types. So let's say I want to look at my back files or my bat files. I can filter just on file type and see only those types of files. And some of those may be important, and I want to make sure that those got copied over. Or if I had that exception in there, I want to make sure that we didn't have any JPEGs and that they were skipped. We want to verify that as well. Now, we're not going to make you do everything in the product. That would just be mean. So you can export these log files as well to CSV or XML, and you can manipulate the data as you see fit. So there are some options for that. But if you just want to run some reports and you want to, deliver those reports to your manager, or you just want to review some things, we've got several reports here available. Again, the same thing that you saw on the dashboard pretty much, which is a summary report. It's going to give you an overview of everything that happened. If you want to look at what files were skipped, you can run a report that does that. It tells you not only the file, but why it was skipped. Access is denied, or the destination file is newer, or the files are the same on both sides. So it'll give you that status. You can also look at your errors report. Again, what's the file? Why did we have an error? Can't find the path, access denied, stuff like that. So you can go back through and start working through any of the errors that you had, and that way you're going to verify everything that happens before you start decommissioning that source server or deleting any files or even trying to use that new server. So you're really going to make sure that you're set up here for a successful migration. So that's pretty much what I want to show you in the post-migration analysis. Greg, do you have anything to add?
I got to hand it to you, Jayson. In that first picture that you showed up there, I think you guys sprung for the 64-color Crayola box, because I think that was actually fuchsia.
Oh, you might be right. I'll have to go back to my color palette and find the exact color. But yeah, so I'm going to close off a little bit here by talking about the resources. So you've got some links that Greg has given you to go get, things like Access Enum and iCackles, and we'll email those links to you. So if you miss those, don't worry. You'll get an email next week with those links. Now, the three products that I showed today from ScriptLogic are, again, Enterprise Security Reporter, Security Explorer, and Secure Copy. And if you want to try any of those, they're available on our website for 30-day trials, and you can go to scriptlogic.com to go download those. And if you want to go contact Greg, he's available at concentratedtech.com. Now, we did mention a website that ScriptLogic puts out called SMBIT Simplified, and Greg even mentioned an article from Jeff Hicks about the switches. Greg is actually another one of our authors on SMBIT Simplified, and one of 4 or 5 different industry experts that are posting articles and videos and blogs every week on this site. And they're really vendor agnostic. We're not trying to sell ScriptLogic products here. We're trying to give you guys articles and useful information to solve problems like, running permissions reports or using PowerShell to control switches when you're copying files. And you'll find that information at scriptlogic.com/SMBIT. And if you are on social media, you can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, or sign up for our newsletter. And you've got to go check it out, because if you've never met Greg before, you've got to go see his little cartoon avatar that we have on the site. It's actually very lifelike.